Texas Hill Country, August 1872. The sun was already high when Willow Vanren stepped into the shallow creek, her skirts hitched up in one hand, a basket looped over the other. The water was cool against her calves, clear as glass over polished stones. Birds rustled high in the cottonwoods lining the banks, and the wind smelled like dust and mesquite. She had not planned to be gone long, just enough time to gather watercress and maybe some wild mint for tea. She never heard the hoofbeats. The first man stepped out from behind a boulder, rifle slung across his chest. A second came from her left, younger, his eyes too bright. Then a third, older with a scar across his jaw, appeared upstream. They moved slow, like they had done this before. Her stomach nodded. "Well now," the scarred one said, "looks like we caught ourselves a bird." "I do not have anything worth stealing," Willow said, voice steady though her heart battered her ribs. The younger one grinned. "That ain't what we're after." She stepped back too fast. Her boots slipped on the mossy rock and she hit the water hard, the basket flying from her hand. Cold soaked through to her skin, but she scrambled upright. "Stay where you are," the scarred man ordered. She glanced behind her. The creek bent westward, thick with brush. No way out. Her father's rifle was back at the cabin, and her nearest neighbor was a half-day's ride. She thought of her mother's grave just up the hill and clenched her fists tight. Then, a single shot cracked through the air. One of the men dropped, screaming, clutching his shoulder. The others spun around, rifles raised. Another shot rang out. The younger bandit fell, face first into the water. Willow turned toward the sound, heart thundering. From the ridge above the creek, a man on horseback aimed down at the third bandit. His dark hat shaded his face, but she saw the set of his broad shoulders, the calm steadiness of his hands. The third man ran. Another shot grazed his leg and he tumbled into the brush. The rider nudged his horse down the slope, rifle still ready. Willow stood frozen, water dripping from her skirt as he reached her. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, lips parted, unsure what to say. He dismounted in one smooth motion, eyes scanning the trees. "They are gone. Probably for good." He stepped closer then, and she saw him clearly, tall, dust-covered, a streak of blood on his sleeve that was not his. His eyes were pale gray, like storm clouds over limestone. His voice was rough but quiet. "Name's Jonah Zeller." "Willow Vanren," she said. He nodded once. "I am going to lift you up." "That fine." She hesitated, then nodded again. He bent, one arm behind her knees, the other at her back, and lifted her from the creek like she weighed nothing. His chest was warm and solid, and she wrapped her arms around his neck without thinking. His horse, a dark bay gelding, snorted and shifted as Jonah swung up into the saddle with her in his arms. Willow pressed close, her soaked dress cold against his shirt. They rode hard for nearly 20 minutes, far enough to be sure the bandits were not following. He slowed near a rocky outcrop and dismounted, setting her gently on her feet. "You hurt?" he asked, stepping back. "No," she said, cheeks flushed. "Just shaken." He nodded. "Let us rest a moment." They sat near the shade of the rocks. Jonah handed her a canteen and she drank. His eyes never left the horizon, watchful. "I was just gathering greens," she said, voice thin. "You live alone. My mother passed last spring. I manage the place myself now." He looked at her then. "That is a hard road." "I manage," she said, lifting her chin. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. "I can see that." She looked down at her hands. "I do not know how to thank you." "You do not need to," he said simply. "No one should be left to face men like that alone." Willow glanced at him. "I would not have made it out." His voice softened. "You did. You are here." They rode back to her cabin and he stayed until sundown, helping her fix the broken door latch and checking the barn. He never asked for supper, but she gave it anyway: cornbread, beans, and the last of the smoked pork. At the table, under the flickering oil lamp, she studied him. His hands were large, scarred, but careful. He moved slow, like someone used to waiting out storms. He had not said much, but when he did, it mattered. "Why were you near the creek?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Been trailing those men 4 days. They robbed a family outside Blanco." "Killed the father." She swallowed hard. "You are a lawman." "No, just someone who does not like cowards robbing widows." Something inside her shifted at that. She reached for his hand across the table without thinking. He did not pull away. "You could stay the night," she said softly. "It is a long ride back," he hesitated. "I would not want to give the wrong impression." "I asked because I would feel safer," she said. "That is all." He looked at her a long moment, then he nodded. "I will take the chair by the door." She gave him a blanket, and he sat with his rifle across his knees, watching the front windows while she slipped into her room. That night, sleep came slow. Her body remembered the cold creek, the fear. But she also remembered his arms, strong and sure, the sound of his voice steady above the gunfire. In the dark, she whispered his name once, trying it on her tongue. Jonah Zeller. She felt safer knowing he was just on the other side of the wall. And somehow, she knew this was not the last time she would see him. The next morning broke slow and gold. Willow stood at the hearth stirring cornmeal into a thin gruel, her hands moving without thought. Outside, doves cooed from the roofline, and the smell of dew-wet sage hung in the still air. She glanced toward the doorway, where Jonah sat in the ladder-back chair, half asleep, boots crossed and rifle resting across his lap. His eyes opened before she spoke. "I can take over from here," he said, standing. "You were watching all night." He stretched his shoulders, then walked to the basin and poured water from the jug. Didn't feel long. She set 2 tin bowls on the table. "I only had cornmeal and dried apples." He sat, nodding. "That's more than I expected." They ate in quiet, the kind that didn't press or prod. When the bowls were scraped clean, Jonah rose and moved to the door. "I'll check the fence line. Won't be long." "I'll bring feed to the hens," she said, tying her hair back. By the time the sun rose high enough to draw sweat from their temples, the coop was repaired, the barn door rehung, and the last of the storm-felled branches dragged from the path. Willow followed Jonah back to the house, her arms full of kindling. He held the door for her, then stepped inside last, brushing dirt from his sleeves. "I'll ride out this afternoon," he said, setting his hat on the table. She wiped her hands on her apron. "You're not staying through sundown. I've got folks waiting on word, the family that lost their land. They'll need to know the men won't be back." She didn't ask if he'd go all the way to Blanco that night. She just nodded and moved to the cupboard for a jar of pickled okra. "How long you been riding alone?" she asked, voice quiet. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Since I was 17. My older brother took a bullet in the leg during the war. Couldn't ride after that. Someone had to keep the cattle going." She handed him the jar and sat across from him. "You've always been in Texas." He looked toward the window, where the wind shifted the curtain just enough to show the edge of the prairie. "Started out near Lampasas, moved south after my father passed." She studied the way his eyes held to the horizon. "You still see him sometimes?" "In dreams." His jaw worked once before he answered. "Not lately. Used to. My mother's been gone near 6 months," she said, "but I still catch myself reaching for her shawl when it turns cold." He didn't speak, but his gaze returned to hers, steady and unflinching. "I never figured I'd end up here alone," she said, "with no one but a mule and a patch of land too rocky for corn." "It's good land," he said. "You've kept it alive." A quiet passed between them, not heavy, just full. She stood and began gathering the dishes. "I've got a root cellar needs shoring. The beams are starting to sag. I'll take a look at it before I go." She turned, drying her hands. "You don't have to. I know." They worked the rest of the day side by side, lifting stones, replacing a rotted beam, and bracing the frame with cedar cut from the ridge behind the house. The sun beat down hard, but the silence between them had softened, shaped by rhythm and sweat and shared effort. When the last nail was sunk and the tools were hung back on their pegs, Willow brought out a jar of blackberry preserves and 2 tin spoons. They sat on the stoop, eating slow, the sky above them streaked with lavender. "You never said what you'll do when you're done chasing men like that," Willow said. He turned the spoon in his hand. "Hadn't thought much past it. No place you miss. Used to think I'd build something near the Brazos. River runs slow there, good for cattle. But then I got used to moving." She set her spoon down. "You could stop if you wanted." He looked at her then, and something shifted in his expression, not soft, but less guarded. "Maybe I could." They sat until the stars came out, the jar between them empty. When he rose, she did too. "I'll ride at first light," he said. "I figured." He reached for his hat, then paused. "You think you'll be all right? I've been worse," she said. "But I wouldn't mind someone checking the fence line now and again." His eyes searched hers. "I could do that." "Good," she said, voice low. He stepped closer, not touching, but near enough that she could feel the heat off his skin. "I'll come back." "I know." Then he turned, swung into the saddle, and rode west, his silhouette fading into the night-shadowed grass. Willow stood with her arms wrapped around herself, not from cold, but from something she couldn't name yet. But the wind felt different now, less like loneliness, more like a promise. The rains came late that autumn, slow and warm, softening the dust until the ground gave off the smell of stone and root. Willow worked by lantern light now that the days drew short. She kept the fire banked high and her rifle within reach, though the nights had stayed quiet since Jonah's departure. He returned in the second week of October, just as the leaves began to bronze and curl. She saw him before he called out, riding slow from the south trail, his coat mud-flecked, his hat low against the wind. She stood at the edge of the porch, arms crossed, waiting. "You said you'd come back," she said as he dismounted. "I meant to be sooner." He looped the reins around the hitching post. "There was another farm west of Mason. Took longer than I figured." She nodded once, then stepped aside so he could pass beneath the lintel. Inside, the room held the scent of beeswax and sage. She had boiled potatoes and turnip greens earlier, and the cast iron pot still sat on the trivet. Jonah removed his coat and hung it by the door without asking. "I've got more than I can eat," she said. "If you're hungry." He glanced at her, then at the table. "Always." They ate without ceremony, and when the bowls were cleaned and stacked, she poured what was left of the coffee into 2 tin cups and sat across from him. The wind knocked gently at the shutters, and the oil lamp hissed low. "I've been thinking on something," she said, tracing the rim of her cup. "There's a stretch of land past the ridge used to be an old Comanche trail. It's overgrown, but the soil's dark. Could hold beans in the spring." He leaned forward slightly. "You want to plant more? There's more than I can manage on my own." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. "You asking for help? I'm offering a piece of something that could grow." His fingers tapped once against the cup. "I've been riding too long. Forgot what it's like staying put." "I haven't," she said. "I just got used to pretending I didn't mind the quiet." He stood then, slow, like the thought had weight. She didn't move, just watched him as he crossed to the hearth and stared into the banked coals. "I sold my cattle," he said after a moment. "All but the gelding. Told myself it'd make the road lighter." "Would you take a share in mine instead?" Her voice didn't waver. He turned. "You sure?" "I wouldn't ask if I wasn't." His gaze held hers long enough that she felt something settle in her chest, like a gate swinging closed after a long storm. "I'll build a pen out back," he said. "Fix that far trough too." She allowed herself a small breath. "There's a shed with tools enough." He nodded once. They stepped outside together, the air sharp with wood smoke. Clouds moved low over the hills and the sky had turned the color of slate. "Tomorrow we start early," she said. "I'll be here," he answered. She looked at him then, really looked the way the lines around his eyes deepened when he wasn't guarded, the scar near his temple, faded and pale. He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers, and she didn't pull away. "I never planned to stay anywhere," he said. "I never planned to let anyone in," she replied. He took her hand fully then, palm warm against hers. No rush, no need for more, just the weight of it steady and real. They stood like that, facing the darkened land. And though nothing was spoken beyond that, they both understood some things didn't need words to begin. The first frost came early. Thin ice sheathed the water troughs by morning, and the wind stiffened through the junipers, carrying the dry, brittle scent of cedar bark. Jonah rose before dawn, as he'd done every morning since settling into the small lean-to he'd built beside the barn. He never asked to sleep inside, and Willow hadn't pressed him. There was a rhythm between them now, unspoken but steady as the wheel of seasons they worked inside. She was already at the stove when he stepped into the cabin. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, hair pinned back, and flour dusted her apron. The kettle hissed, and a pan of salt pork crackled over the flames. "You've got a hitch in your right shoulder," she said, not looking up. "You favor it when you carry the feed." Jonah poured water into the basin and dipped his hands. "That's from a fall off a fence rail when I was a boy, never healed clean." She added a pinch of dried sage to the skillet. "You never said you had brothers, too. One's buried near San Saba. The other's a blacksmith in Lano." She turned then, wooden spoon in hand. "You ever think of going back there?" He shook his head. "Not anymore." She set the spoon down. "I'm glad for that." They ate quietly, not out of discomfort but from the fullness of the morning. Afterward, he gathered his coat from the peg. She handed him a pair of thick gloves she'd stitched from old canvas and lined with wool. "Fence posts on the north slope need resetting," he said. "Ground's hard. Might take all day. There's a shed I've been meaning to clean out. My father's tools are still in there, some rusted near through." He stepped out first, and she followed him to the porch. The sky was the color of tarnished silver, and in the distance, a hawk circled low over the cottonwoods. Before he turned toward the pasture, he paused. "You ever think about putting up another room?" he asked. She blinked. "For the house," he nodded. "If the weather turns worse next year, you'll want more space for stores. Maybe a chimney on the east side so you can heat both ends." She studied his face, the way his brow furrowed when he thought about things not yet spoken aloud. "You'd help build it?" He didn't hesitate. "I would." She nodded once. "Then I'll draw a plan." That afternoon, while he worked the post-hole digger into the frozen ground, she hauled out broken crates and mildewed tarps from the old shed. Near the back, beneath a warped shelf, she found a tin box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were yellowed papers, her father's ledger, some letters in her mother's hand, and a faded daguerreotype of the two of them standing outside a church in Bourne. She held the photograph in her lap as dusk fell, her back against the wall of the shed, the air growing colder around her. There was something in her mother's face, a quiet certainty that mirrored what she'd begun to feel in the stillness between herself and Jonah. When she stepped out into the yard, he was kneeling beside the last post, tamping the dirt firm with a scrap of timber. His breath came in visible clouds, and his hands were raw despite the gloves. "You missed supper," she said. He looked up. "Didn't want to quit before it was right." She stepped closer and held out the tin box. "I found this. Thought you might want to see it." He took the photograph gently, turning it toward the last of the light. "That your folks?" She nodded. "They built this place with almost nothing. My father cleared every stone by hand. My mother ran the field rows barefoot to save her boots." He handed the image back. "That kind of love makes a place live longer than the people in it." They walked back to the house together. Inside, she stirred up the fire and unwrapped a cloth bundle of sweet potatoes she'd cooked in the coals. He sat at the table, watching her move, the light catching the curve of her cheek. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said the day I came back." She turned, wiping her hands. "About the land," he met her eyes. "About building something that grows." She waited. "I never had a reason to stay anywhere," he said. "Always figured I'd keep riding until the road ran out, but I've stopped looking toward the next trail." She stepped closer. "And now I'm looking at you." The fire cracked once, loud in the hush. "I don't want promises," she said. "Not unless they're meant to be kept." He stood, slow and certain. "I don't make the kind I don't intend to keep." She reached for his hand, and he took it without pause. The warmth of his palm against hers was the only answer she needed. Outside, the wind sighed through the bare branches. But inside the walls they'd tended together, there was only stillness. Not the kind that comes from absence, but the kind that means something has finally settled where it belongs. A week after the frost broke, Willow stood in the doorway of the half-finished extension, her arms folded against the late afternoon chill. The new room had taken shape faster than she'd expected: rough-hewn pine walls, a second hearth laid in stone, and a low shelf built into the far wall with Jonah's careful hands. He was under the eaves now, fitting the last cedar shingle into place, his shirt damp at the back, his fingers steady even as the light began to thin. "You'll lose the sun if you keep at it," she called up. He squinted down, one knee braced against the roof's edge. "Just one more row." She stepped inside, let the door swing behind her, and cleared space on the table. A loaf of oat bread cooled under linen, still warm from the oven. She cut 2 thick slices and brought them out with a crock of honey and a tin cup of cider. By the time he climbed down, the sky was a deep violet, the trees along the ridge gone black in silhouette. "You're stubborn," she said, handing him the bread. He sat on the porch step, brushing sawdust from his trousers. "You could have stopped me." She sat beside him, close enough their knees touched. "You don't stop a man like you. You just let him finish what he's set his mind to." He tore a piece of bread and dipped it into the honey. "I found a mark on one of the old beams." "Looked like your father used to count the seasons there." She nodded. "He carved a line every spring, said if the land gave something back, it deserved to be remembered." He looked at her, brows drawn. "Would you want to keep that tradition?" Her voice was soft. "I think I would." They sat until the evening cooled their skin, until the wind moved low through the grass and the first stars came shyly out. She leaned into his side and he shifted, letting her head rest against his shoulder. "I've been thinking on the name," Jonah said quietly. She turned her face to him. "What name for the place? You ever call it anything?" "My mother used to say it didn't need one. It was just home." He considered that. "Maybe that's enough." She smiled against his sleeve. "It is now." The next day, Jonah rode into town with the last of the hides from winter's cull, and when he returned, he brought back a small box wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath his coat. He laid it on the table while she was steeping tea and waited without saying a word. She untied the string slowly, fingers working without hurry. Inside was a silver ring, plain but well made, the band just narrow enough to catch the light. She looked up and his eyes didn't waver. "I didn't ask your permission first," Jonah said, voice low. "Figured you'd tell me if it wasn't time." She reached across and took his hand, her fingers curling into his palm. "Yes," she said, "it's time." He let out a slow breath, and she saw something break open in him, not weakness, but release, like he'd been holding himself still for too long. They married beneath the cottonwood that spring, just as the wild irises bloomed pale blue along the creek. 2 neighbors came as witnesses, and the preacher rode in from Fredericksburg, his coat dusted with pollen and road grit. The ceremony was brief, spoken in full sunlight, with the sound of birds high in the branches and the wind carrying the scent of turned earth. Willow wore a dress stitched from her mother's old muslin, and Jonah wore his best shirt, patched at the elbow but clean. They stood facing each other barefoot, the grass damp beneath them, and when they said their vows, neither looked away. That evening they sat on the porch and watched the fireflies rise like sparks from the fields. She leaned into him, her hand resting over his heart, and he kissed her temple, then her cheek, then her mouth, slow and sure, like he meant it to last. Months passed and the house grew fuller. The garden stretched wider, the chickens fattened, and the beans came in strong. Jonah built a smokehouse near the back fence, and Willow hung dried herbs in the rafters of the new room. They shared the work, the worry, the weather, and on quiet nights when the sky was clear and the lanterns were out, they shared stories of the people they'd once been, and the people they were still becoming. One August evening, as the cicadas hummed and the air hung thick with the scent of clover, Willow stood in the doorway again, watching Jonah mend a gate latch. "I've been feeling different," she said. He turned, straightening up. "What kind of different?" She walked to him, took his hand, and placed it low against her belly. "That kind." His eyes widened, then softened, and he drew her close without a word. His hand stayed there, resting gently as if he could already feel the life growing beneath. She pressed her forehead to his chest and let herself be held. That winter, the child came a daughter, born in the hush just before dawn. Jonah wrapped her in linen and placed her in Willow's arms, his hands careful, his shoulders trembling. They named her Clara, for the first cool wind that cut through the heat the day they finished the extension. She had Willow's eyes and Jonah's quiet. They grew together, not fast but deep. And in the years that followed, the house stood firm against every storm. The garden never failed, and the sound of laughter lived among the beams where once there had only been silence. And always, when the first green pushed through the soil each spring, Willow carved a line into the beam her father had marked. A new season, a new life, a home made from what had once been only survival, now rooted in love.